Most people imagine the medieval period as a world of castles and stone fortresses. But the truth is, the vast majority of people lived in small, hand-built homes made from whatever they could find. These were the poorest members of society: peasants, laborers, and villagers, who didn't have access to money, machines, or skilled labor. And yet, they built homes that could stand through seasons, storms, and daily life with nothing but their hands and natural materials. Number 1, local materials only. Back in medieval times, if you were poor, and most people were, you had to rely entirely on what the land gave you. Buying building materials simply wasn't an option for peasants. Everything that went into the construction of their homes came from the local environment. That meant forests, fields, rivers, and even their own livestock. It was all about making use of whatever was nearby, and nothing went to waste. Wood was one of the most essential materials, but access to it was limited. Forests were usually controlled by landlords or the crown, and cutting down trees without permission could lead to heavy fines or worse. So peasants stuck to gathering fallen branches or cutting small trees like hazel or willow, which were more readily available and often grew at the edges of fields or in hedgerows. These kinds of wood were especially useful for making wattle, which formed the framework for the walls. For larger structural pieces, people reused old timber whenever possible. If someone's house collapsed or was abandoned, that wood got scavenged quickly. Mud was another key material, and it was everywhere. It might not sound impressive, but it was absolutely essential. Peasants would dig it up from riverbanks or any wet, clay-rich soil they could find. When mixed with straw and sometimes animal dung, it became part of the daub that covered the wattle framework. Dung helped bind the mix and added to its insulation properties. It also acted as a kind of natural antifreeze, slowing down the freezing and cracking that could happen in colder months. Straw was easy to get after harvest season. It was what remained of cereal crops like wheat or barley. Most peasants grew their own grains, so straw was a byproduct that could be put to use. They used it not only in the walls, but also for roofing material, insulation, floor covering, and even bedding. Long straw was particularly valuable because it was easier to work with and more durable. Animal dung, especially from cows, was surprisingly useful. In addition to its role in wall construction, it was sometimes burned as fuel if firewood was scarce. But in building, it added strength to daub and helped seal gaps in both walls and floors. It might not have smelled great, but it worked, and that was what mattered. Stone was less common for peasants, but if it was available nearby, like in hilly or rocky regions, it got used. Usually it wasn't for full walls, which took a lot of work, but for foundations, drainage channels, or steps. Loose field stones were gathered while clearing farmland and stacked to create a basic level surface. Mortar wasn't always used. Stones were often laid dry, just carefully balanced. Everything came from within walking distance. If something wasn't on your land or your neighbor's, it wasn't used. Transporting materials over long distances wasn't realistic, especially without carts or animals. That's why each region had slightly different building styles. Homes reflected the materials the land could offer. The result was a kind of rough, functional architecture born directly from the landscape, shaped by necessity and survival. Number 2, timber frames first. When it came to building a home in medieval times, especially for those at the bottom of society, everything started with the timber frame. This was the structural backbone of the entire house. Without it, there was nothing to hang walls on or support a roof. Poor peasants didn't have fancy tools or plans, but they had knowledge passed down through generations and access to basic tools like axes, wooden mallets, and wedges. The process was physical, rough, and simple, but surprisingly effective. The first step was choosing the timber itself. People didn't chop down the best trees; those were usually reserved for the lord's estate. Instead, peasants collected smaller trees or branches from local forests, or they scavenged timber from fallen trees, old barns, or abandoned houses. Oak, ash, and elm were commonly used if available because they were sturdy and durable. Green wood, freshly cut wood, was sometimes used because it was easier to shape. But people also understood that it could warp, so whenever possible, they let it season for a bit to dry out. Once enough timber was collected, they began shaping the main structural posts and beams. Everything was done by hand. Axes carved the wood roughly to size. Wedges split logs and mallets hammered pieces into place. No one had precision saws, and everything was measured by eye or simple strings and sticks. Despite this, the results were good enough. Medieval builders understood proportions from experience, not blueprints. The standard layout was a rectangular shape with vertical posts placed directly into the earth or on top of large flat stones if they were available. These stones helped prevent the wood from rotting too quickly. Horizontal beams were placed across the top to connect the vertical posts and add stability. Diagonal braces were sometimes added to prevent the structure from swaying. There were no nails involved. Metal was too expensive for peasants. Instead, they used mortise and tenon joints secured with wooden pegs. These joints were carved so that one piece of wood slotted into another like a puzzle, and then was pinned in place with a hand-carved wooden dowel. Accuracy wasn't perfect, and the frame might lean or twist slightly, but it didn't really matter. What mattered was strength and functionality. These frames were built to last through rain, wind, and snow, and if they leaned, peasants simply adjusted the rest of the build around it. Practicality came before appearance. Building the frame was not a solo job. Families pitched in and neighbors helped each other, kind of like a barn raising in later centuries. Community labor made construction faster and also created a sense of solidarity. People knew they'd get help back when it was their turn to build or rebuild. This cooperative spirit was essential in villages where resources and time were both limited. Once the timber frame was raised, it marked a major milestone. Everything else, walls, roof, interior, depended on that wooden skeleton. If it stood firm, the rest could follow. Even if the rest of the house was basic and made from mud, straw, and dung, that timber frame gave it structure and strength. Number 3, wattle and daub walls. When it came to building walls, medieval peasants relied on a surprisingly effective and ancient technique, wattle and daub. This method wasn't just affordable, it was practical, adaptable, and made entirely from materials they could gather themselves. It started with weaving flexible branches, often hazel, willow, or sometimes even elder. These branches were chosen for their bendiness, which made them easier to work with. They were woven horizontally between upright wooden posts, creating a kind of natural mesh or lattice. That mesh was called the wattle. It acted like the scaffolding or skeleton for the wall, providing a surface for the next layer to stick to. Once the wattle was in place, the next step was covering it with daub. The daub mixture varied slightly depending on the region and what was available, but the basic ingredients were pretty consistent: clay-rich mud, chopped straw, and animal dung. Dung wasn't just added randomly, it helped bind the material and gave it flexibility, reducing cracks as the wall dried. In some cases, people added lime to make it more durable and resistant to pests and moisture. The daub was mixed by hand, or more often by foot. Peasants would stomp it all together in big batches before applying it to the wall. Applying daub was straightforward but messy. It was slapped, smeared, or pressed onto the wattle until all the gaps were filled. This layer would then dry and harden into a surprisingly tough surface. It also offered basic insulation, helping to keep warmth in during winter and heat out in the summer. In wetter climates, people used more straw in the mix, which improved water resistance and helped prevent the wall from washing away during heavy rains. Drying took days, even weeks depending on the weather, and cracks were common, but those cracks were patched with more daub. This was an ongoing maintenance routine. Once dried, the walls might be whitewashed with lime for extra protection and brightness. While it sounds primitive, wattle and daub was a smart, sustainable way for poor families to build decent homes without spending a single coin. And it wasn't just for peasants. This technique was used in medieval towns and even on some manor outbuildings. It was proof that low cost didn't have to mean low quality. Number 4, thatched roofs. Thatched roofs were the go-to choice for the poorest in medieval times because they were made from natural, cheap, and easy-to-find materials. People used whatever was available locally. straw from wheat or rye harvests, reeds from riverbanks, or heather in some regions. These materials were bundled tightly and laid in overlapping layers, starting from the bottom edge of the roof and working upward. This layering technique helped water run off efficiently, which was crucial in rainy climates. The steep slope of these roofs wasn't just for looks. It made a big difference when it rained or snowed. The angle allowed water to drain quickly, preventing leaks and reducing the chances of rot. A flatter roof would absorb water, making the straw heavy and prone to collapse. With a steep pitch, the thatch dried faster and stayed intact longer. In areas with more snow, roofs were sometimes built even steeper to prevent heavy snow from piling up. Constructing a thatched roof took time but didn't require advanced tools.